The Galactic Council's most sacred protocol stated that no living being could survive exposure to the void. They'd seen entire fleets vanish into its silent embrace. Then they sent a human volunteer into the containment chamber. Watch what happens when centuries of alien certainty meet one simple human smile. The Galactic Council's founding document contained exactly one immutable rule. It wasn't printed on paper or stored in some fancy database. They'd etched it into quantum-resistant crystal, the kind of material they normally use to contain singularities, because some truths were too important to risk losing. Every species that petitioned for membership brought their own horror stories about the void. The Krillix told of an entire generation ship that simply ceased transmitting when it approached the dark boundary. The Vexillarians had monuments to 3 lost homeworlds, each consumed by void incursions before they developed proper shielding technology. These weren't campfire stories. They were trauma etched into genetic memory across the galaxy. Their collective wisdom formed an unshakable dogma. Exposure meant certain erasure. Not death, not disintegration, but complete ontological deletion from existence. They'd built containment chambers that could theoretically hold a collapsing star, just to study fragments of void energy smaller than a neutrino. The engineering specs for these facilities read like religious texts, with safety protocols that took longer to recite than most species' mating rituals. Entire exploratory fleets had vanished pursuing scientific curiosity about that silent darkness. The Gelman Collective lost 7 research vessels before concluding that some questions shouldn't be asked. Their crystalline minds, capable of predicting quantum foam behavior across galactic clusters, unanimously agreed that biological organisms couldn't withstand pure void. This protocol wasn't mere advice. It became the foundation of interstellar law and safety regulations. Council members would rather lose planets than risk breaching this ultimate boundary. Their certainty was built on millennia of catastrophic evidence and species-wide agreement. This wasn't just science, it was doctrine. Their absolute truth defined civilization's entire relationship with the unknown. They approached the void like priests approaching an angry god, with rituals, precautions, and absolute submission to its power. Every safety measure, every warning system, every emergency protocol assumed one universal constant: biology breaks before the void. Meanwhile, in a minor filing system 17 levels below the main council chambers, human psychological profiles gathered digital dust. The assessment team had flagged them as biologically erratic and cognitively unconventional. Their file contained notes about something called adrenaline sports and horror movie entertainment. The council archivists considered them mildly interesting but fundamentally flawed. They never imagined these peculiar profiles would challenge everything they knew about existence itself. The Vexillarians approached the containment system design with 16-limbed precision. Each appendage moved in perfect coordination, manipulating tools and holographic interfaces with efficiency that made other species vaguely uncomfortable. They'd earned this assignment through tragic expertise. Their species had lost 3 homeworlds to void incursions before developing proper shielding. That kind of institutional trauma tends to focus the engineering mind wonderfully. They engineered the observation chamber with 17 redundant safety measures because 16 felt reckless and 18 seemed obsessive. Each safety system could independently extract a subject in 0.03 seconds at the first sign of distress. The systems could detect biochemical changes before the subject's own nervous system registered them. Their designs read like architectural anxiety manifested in titanium and energy fields. The Gelman Collective provided the theoretical framework, their crystalline minds calculating variables that would give organic beings migraines. They could predict the behavior of quantum foam across galactic clusters with 99.9999% accuracy. Their equations modeled vacuum decay scenarios that made other physicists request tranquilizers. Yet every calculation about biological organisms facing pure void returned the same result. Their model showed neural pathways unraveling, cellular structures disassembling, consciousness dissolving into background radiation. The chamber's sensor array could detect the spin of a single electron from 3 systems away. It monitored gravitational fluctuations smaller than those caused by a butterfly's wings. It tracked quantum entanglement states that most species didn't even have words for. Every diagnostic, every calibration, every systems check confirmed the same physical laws they'd known for millennia. The equipment was so sensitive it could probably detect a council member's doubtful thoughts from the observation deck. Every measurement pointed toward inevitable biological disintegration. Every theoretical model predicted catastrophic failure of organic systems. Every historical precedent showed complete ontological erasure. The Vexillarian engineers and Gell-Mann physicists had created perhaps the most complete scientific consensus in galactic history. Their certainty wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. Their confidence wasn't dogma, it was demonstrated physics. As the final systems check completed, the chamber stood ready. Its perfect sphere of contained nothingness waited behind 19 layers of protective shielding. The emergency extraction protocols hung in ready status, poised to respond faster than thought. The observation team adjusted their instruments one final time, checking calibrations that had already been checked 17 times. Their preparations were complete. Their understanding was absolute. Their predictions were certain. Meanwhile, in the preparation room, a human subject waited. They'd been given the standard pre-experiment briefing about existential risks and emergency procedures. They'd signed 17 disclosure forms in triplicate. They'd undergone the full medical and psychological evaluation. Now they sat on a standard-issue waiting bench, swinging their legs slightly. They appeared to be counting the ceiling tiles. Or possibly humming. The surveillance systems weren't quite sure. Humanity's application to the Galactic Concord initially received a polite rejection notice citing biological erraticism as the primary concern. The assessment team hadn't meant it as an insult, merely a clinical observation based on their standardized evaluation metrics. Their file contained psychological profiles that defied every conventional categorization system the Council used. Where other species' graphs showed neat clusters of behavioral patterns, human data points scattered across the charts like someone had thrown ink at the screen. Council analysts noted with professional bewilderment that humans sought out unpredictable situations for recreational purposes. Their historical records showed people willingly climbing frozen waterfalls, jumping from perfectly functional aircraft, and diving into unexplored underwater caves. The risk assessment department initially believed these were emergency survival scenarios until they discovered humans called these activities weekend hobbies. Their reports kept using the word voluntary, with a sort of distressed italics that suggested the concept itself was causing them professional discomfort. They demonstrated a peculiar relationship with danger that other species found baffling at best and pathological at worst. While civilizations across the galaxy developed increasingly sophisticated safety systems and trauma avoidance protocols, humans deliberately created controlled risks. They built machines specifically for experiencing simulated mortal peril, constructed elaborate fictional scenarios about existential threats, and even paid currency to experience fear in controlled environments. The Council's psychological board spent 3 meetings debating whether this represented an evolutionary adaptation or a collective mental health crisis. Their entertainment media provided particularly troubling data points. Humans consumed stories about their own species' extermination, fictionalized apocalypses, and metaphorical representations of existential dread. They watched these narratives for enjoyment, often while consuming snacks. Medical scans showed unusual neurotransmitter activity during high-stress scenarios that resembled what other species experienced during mating rituals or spiritual epiphanies. Their brains apparently interpreted existential threat as something between a puzzle and a party. Standard psychological models would flag 63% of humans as requiring immediate therapeutic intervention. Their stress responses operated on completely different parameters. Their fear reactions followed inverted curves, and their danger assessment instincts seemed to have developed a peculiar blind spot regarding self-preservation. The Council's classification team ultimately settled on moderately interesting but fundamentally flawed as the official designation. They quietly hoped humanity would develop more sensible biological programming in a few millennia. Meanwhile, in the preparation chamber, the human volunteer was asking one of the technicians about temperature control options. They wondered if the void exposure might cause a chill, and whether the chamber could be set to a specific warmth setting for optimal comfort. The Vexillarian technician, whose species hadn't experienced chill since developing environmental controls 50,000 years prior, stared with 7 of its 16 eyes while the other 9 consulted the manual for unexpected biological requirements. The initial human exposure tests involved minimal, void energy in carefully shielded environments. Council scientists had prepared for measurable distress signals across all biometric readings, the kind of data that typically triggered immediate termination protocols. Their instruments were calibrated to detect the slightest physiological disruption, the faintest whisper of existential panic. They anticipated textbook reactions, spiking cortisol levels, elevated heart rates, neural patterns scrambling in self-preservation mode. The safety team stood by with emergency extraction systems primed to respond in milliseconds. They had charts and graphs ready to document another confirmation of their universal truth. The human subject reported feeling slightly chilly during the first micro-exposure. Their voice remained calm, conversational as if commenting on room temperature rather than facing cosmic annihilation. The monitoring equipment showed cortisol levels holding steady within normal parameters, while other species would already be showing full panic responses. Neural activity patterns lit up in regions associated with curiosity and pattern recognition, rather than the expected terror centers. The subject's breathing rhythm didn't change. Their heart rate maintained its resting pace. The biometric displays showed what looked like a meditation session, rather than an existential crisis. The subject began asking questions about void properties instead of requesting immediate termination. They inquired about energy signatures, quantum fluctuations, potential observable phenomena. Their queries suggested they viewed the experience as a scientific opportunity rather than a survival threat. Standard psychological assessment tools returned contradictory readings that made the analysis software flicker with confusion. The systems had been programmed to recognize fear, panic, disintegration patterns. They had no reference points for calm inquiry in the face of ultimate danger. The human's physiological responses more closely resembled deep meditation than confrontation with the void. Researchers initially attributed these readings to calibration errors or equipment malfunction. They ran diagnostic checks on sensors that could detect a single neuron firing across the chamber. The instruments reported perfect functionality. They reviewed the safety protocols, checking each system against established parameters. Everything was operating within specification. The emergency extraction protocol remained in standby mode, waiting for any indication of distress that never arrived. The science team exchanged puzzled looks across the observation deck, their certainty beginning its first subtle fractures. Meanwhile, the subject was sketching containment field patterns on their datapad. They appeared to be making observational drawings of the energy distortions, occasionally humming a tune that the audio pickups identified as an old human folk song. Their posture remained relaxed, one leg crossed over the other. They shifted position occasionally, not in distress but in the manner of someone finding a more comfortable angle for their sketching. The safety systems continued their silent vigil, their triggers untouched, their emergency protocols gathering metaphorical dust while the human made art in the face of everything. The galaxy knew to be terrifying. The standard protocol assumed self-preservation would override all other biological impulses. This wasn't speculation. It was documented across 17,000 species stress responses. The emergency systems were designed around this fundamental truth, their triggers tuned to detect the neurological signatures of instinctive withdrawal. Every safety measure anticipated the subject pulling back, curling inward, seeking escape. The entire containment philosophy was built on organic beings' natural inclination to avoid annihilation. Human neural mapping revealed something entirely different. Their brain scans showed increased activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and analytical thinking. The areas that lit up during complex problem-solving became particularly active. Instead of the expected fear responses, their prefrontal cortex showed engagement levels normally seen during intense study or creative work. The amygdala, which should have been screaming danger signals, remained curiously quiet. Their neural pathways were treating the void like an interesting math problem, rather than an existential threat. They attempted to categorize void phenomena using their own primitive scientific frameworks. The subject asked about measuring energy fluctuations, documenting visual phenomena, even taking samples. They suggested adjusting exposure levels to test different variables. Their questions sounded like a research scientist planning an experiment rather than a test subject facing certain erasure. They wondered aloud about theoretical models that might explain void properties, tossing out hypotheses with the calm demeanor of someone discussing weather patterns. Their biometrics showed signs associated with focused attention rather than panic. Heart rate variability indicated a state of concentration, not distress. Pupil dilation suggested cognitive engagement rather than fear. Respiratory patterns matched those of deep meditation or intense study. The physiological markers that normally signaled imminent system collapse instead pointed toward heightened mental activity. The safety monitors kept waiting for crisis signals that never arrived. Council scientists had no existing classification for this type of reaction to existential threats. Their taxonomic systems contained categories for terror, panic, dissociation, and catastrophic neurological shutdown. They had detailed protocols for every known stress response across the galactic community. But they had no framework for calm curiosity in the face of ultimate danger. Their instrumentation could measure the phenomena perfectly well. They just didn't have any reference points for what the measurements meant. The humans' question suggested they viewed the void as a puzzle rather than a predator. They asked about its properties, its behavior, its potential applications. Their tone conveyed intellectual interest rather than mortal dread. They seemed genuinely curious about the mechanisms behind the phenomenon that made other species develop religious avoidance rituals. This cognitive approach represented a fundamental break from all known biological programming across the explored galaxy. As the observation team adjusted their instruments for the third time, the human hummed a familiar tune. The audio sensors picked up the vibrations, analyzing the frequency patterns against known human musical traditions. The melody was something called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, a children's nursery rhyme about curiosity and wonder. The safety systems remained silent, their emergency protocols untouched. While the human quietly sang to themselves in the face of everything the galaxy knew should be terrifying. The Council's emergency meeting lasted 14 standard hours without reaching consensus. They sat in the circular chamber that had witnessed centuries of orderly decision-making, their diverse physiologies arranged around the central holographic display like a particularly anxious menagerie. The Vexillarians tapped multiple limbs in nervous rhythms, while the Gelman Collective's crystalline forms shimmered with uncharacteristic fluctuations. Their entire safety framework was beginning to resemble a building whose foundation had just been discovered to be missing. Every protocol in their extensive system assumed certain biological constants when facing the emergency. Extraction triggers were calibrated to specific neurological patterns. The distress detection algorithms were programmed to recognize particular physiological responses. Their entire safety architecture was built on the universal truth that organic beings would exhibit predictable reactions to existential threats. The systems weren't designed to handle calm curiosity in the face of annihilation. The human data contradicted 7 foundational principles of xenopsychology that had stood unchallenged for millennia. Their biometric readings showed patterns that the classification systems literally couldn't categorize. The software kept returning error messages where there should have been panic indicators. The psychological assessment tools, designed to measure degrees of terror and dissociation, instead reported something that looked suspiciously like focused interest. Their instruments were functioning perfectly. It was their understanding of reality that seemed to be malfunctioning. Some council members suggested terminating the experiments entirely to preserve their theoretical frameworks. They argued that the potential risk to their scientific understanding outweighed whatever data they might gather. Their entire classification system for danger responses would need complete revision if these results proved accurate. Better to dismiss the anomaly as some peculiar human malfunction than to reconsider centuries of established science. The comfort of certainty felt preferable to the discomfort of new understanding. Others argued for immediate classification of humans as a potential security threat. Their unconventional reactions suggested a biological unpredictability that could destabilize carefully balanced safety systems. If humans didn't respond to danger like normal beings, how could they be trusted to follow standard protocols? Their very existence in the galactic community might represent an unknown variable that could undermine millennia of carefully established safety measures. Fear of the unknown was beginning to outweigh scientific curiosity. Their risk assessment models had no parameters for subject enjoys the experience. The drop-down menus in their analysis software contained options for terror, panic, dissociation, and catastrophic neurological failure. There was no checkbox for mild interest or intellectual curiosity. Their entire predictive framework was built around the assumption that facing the void would be the most unpleasant experience any being could endure. The concept of someone finding it fascinating represented a complete systems failure of their understanding. Their entire scientific understanding relied on predictable fear responses to ultimate danger. The equations that modeled organic system failure and void exposure all assumed certain neurological and physiological reactions. The safety protocols were designed around milliseconds-long response times to detected distress signals. The humans' continued calm existence in the test environment wasn't just surprising, it threatened to invalidate entire branches of their scientific knowledge. They were watching their understanding of biology unravel in real time. The humans' continued existence in the test environment challenged their core assumptions about consciousness itself. If a being could face complete ontological erasure with what appeared to be professional curiosity, then their entire framework for understanding intelligence needed reconsideration. Perhaps consciousness wasn't about self-preservation above all else. Maybe some minds prioritized understanding over survival in ways they'd never imagined possible. Their certainty was crumbling not from outside pressure, but from internal contradiction. They approved one final test with full exposure against all safety recommendations. The vote was narrowly passed after 14 hours of circular debate, with several members registering formal objections for the historical record. They would expose the human subject to complete void immersion, against every protocol, against every safety regulation, against millennia of accumulated wisdom. It was either brilliant scientific inquiry or catastrophic recklessness. They wouldn't know which until it was over. Meanwhile, the human subject was discussing beverage options with a confused technician. They were requesting a specific type of tea for after the procedure, something called Earl Grey with a particular temperature specification and a specific steeping time. They wondered aloud if the chamber's environment might affect flavor profiles and whether the catering service could accommodate special requests. The technician, who came from a species that consumed nutrient paste through epidermal absorption, made a note to consult the culinary compatibility database while questioning their career choices. The main containment chamber represented the pinnacle of galactic engineering, a perfect sphere of contained nothingness that hurt the eyes to observe directly. Its construction had required manipulating space-time itself into a stable configuration, a process that consumed more energy than some civilizations used in a millennium. The chamber didn't so much occupy space as politely ask reality to step aside for a moment. Its boundaries weren't walls in any conventional sense, but rather the edge of where physics decided to stop behaving predictably. Even light particles ceased following normal laws within its boundaries. Photons would enter and simply forget how to be photons, their wave functions collapsing into mathematical confusion. The chamber didn't darkness so much as it absorbed the very concept of illumination. Sensors placed inside reported contradictory data depending on which quantum state they chose to observe. The entire structure represented a triumph of technology over nature, a place where 17 species, collective genius had finally built a box that could hold nothingness itself. 17 civilizations had contributed their ultimate technological achievements to its creation. The Vexillarians provided the dimensional stabilization field that kept the chamber from unmaking the facility around it. The Gelman Collective contributed the mathematical frameworks that allowed anything to exist within the containment zone at all. Even the Krillix, who generally specialized in agricultural technology, developed the bioscanners that could detect life signs within the unnatural emptiness. Each species had poured their finest intellectual resources into creating the most secure prison for nothingness ever conceived. The chamber could simulate conditions that occurred naturally only near cosmic voids, those vast empty spaces between galactic superclusters where the fabric of reality grew thin and strange. It replicated the quantum fluctuations, the gravitational anomalies, the complete absence of conventional matter that characterized those terrifying regions of space. Scientists normally studied such environments from immense distances using heavily shielded probes. Placing a living being inside represented either unparalleled courage or catastrophic foolishness depending on which council member you asked. Its safety systems could extract a subject in 0.003 seconds at the first sign of distress. The emergency protocol involved briefly bending local space-time to pluck the subject from danger faster than neural impulses could travel from eye to brain. The systems monitored 17 different biological parameters simultaneously, any one of which could trigger immediate extraction. Their sensitivity was so precise they could detect fear responses before the subject consciously registered them. The safety measures represented the galaxy's absolute commitment to preserving life against the void's erasure. Every previous test had ended with automatic emergency extraction within milliseconds. Whether using volunteer subjects from brave species or automated drones simulating biological responses, the outcome remained consistently catastrophic. The systems would detect imminent disintegration and activate rescue protocols before conscious awareness could form. The chamber's safety record showed perfect performance across thousands of trials. Its emergency systems had never failed to respond when faced with biological distress. The Council watched from behind 19 layers of protective shielding, each barrier capable of withstanding supernova-level energies. Their observation deck was separated from the main facility by enough redundant safety systems to make insurance actuaries weep with joy. They observed through heavily filtered viewers that transformed the terrifying nothingness into a slightly more manageable shade of dark gray. Their instruments showed every biological and environmental parameter in crisp detail, ready to document another confirmation of their universal truth about void exposure. They expected another data point confirming their universal truth about the void's absolute danger to biological life. Their post-experiment analysis plans included detailed studies of disintegration patterns and neurological collapse timelines. The emergency response teams stood ready with medical interventions for whatever residual effects might remain after extraction. Every protocol, every safety measure, every scientific assumption pointed toward another demonstration of their fundamental understanding of reality. As the humans stepped across the threshold into perfect nothingness, the emergency extraction systems remained completely idle. Their sensitive triggers detected no distress signals, no panic responses, no biological indicators of system collapse. The safety protocols hung in ready status, their sophisticated algorithms waiting for any sign that never arrived. The humans' biometric readings continued showing the same curious calm they'd exhibited during preliminary tests, their physiological markers indicating nothing more concerning than mild interest. The first 3 seconds established a new record for void exposure survival. Previous tests had never lasted beyond 2.8 seconds before emergency extraction triggered. The timer ticked past that mark without any system activation. The observation deck monitors showed the numbers climbing, while council members watched with increasing confusion. Their faces, or equivalent sensory clusters, displayed varying degrees of professional bewilderment. The Vexillarians had 3 limbs frozen in mid-gesture, while their other 13 continued tapping nervous rhythms on console surfaces. The Gelman collective's crystalline forms showed slight internal refractions that their species manual identified as cognitive dissonance. Council members leaned toward their displays as if physical proximity might correct whatever measurement errors were occurring. Their eyes, or optical equivalents, moved between the humans' biometric readings and the chamber's environmental monitors. The 2 data streams should have been telling the same story of catastrophic system failure. Instead, they showed completely unrelated narratives that somehow involved the same subject. The scientists had prepared for screaming alarms and flashing emergency indicators. They hadn't prepared for calm data that suggested everything was perfectly normal in the face of impossible conditions. The humans' vital signs showed minor fluctuations, but no signs of distress. Heart rate varied by less than 5 beats per minute from baseline. Respiration patterns indicated normal oxygen exchange rather than the expected panic breathing. Neural activity showed curiosity patterns instead of terror responses. The biometric displays looked like someone had copied data from a meditation study and pasted it into an existential crisis scenario. The safety systems kept scanning for distress markers that simply weren't appearing in the expected configurations. The subject's breathing remained regular while neural activity indicated active observation. Their brain scans showed heightened activity in visual processing centers and pattern recognition regions. The areas that should have been overwhelmed with fear responses remained curiously quiet. Instead of neural pathways screaming danger, they appeared to be politely taking notes. The physiological markers suggested a state of focused attention rather than existential panic. The body wasn't fighting for survival. It was apparently conducting fieldwork. Emergency extraction protocols hung in ready status, awaiting any indication of need that never arrived. Their sophisticated algorithms kept running through checklists of disaster scenarios, each returning negative results. The systems could detect a single neuron firing in panic patterns across 3 light-years of space, but they found nothing resembling distress in the chamber. The safety mechanisms remained poised to respond in milliseconds, their triggers untouched. Their emergency protocols gathering digital dust while the human continued existing, where existence shouldn't be possible. Scientists checked and rechecked their instrument calibrations for errors. They ran diagnostic routines on sensors that could detect quantum spin states from neighboring star systems. The equipment reported perfect functionality across all parameters. They reviewed data streams from 17 different monitoring systems, each confirming the same impossible readings. The instruments weren't malfunctioning. They were faithfully reporting data that contradicted everything they knew about biology and physics. Their tools were working perfectly while their understanding was falling apart. The subject's posture remained relaxed rather than the expected defensive curling. Most species instinctively adopted fetal positions when facing existential threats, a primitive biological response that minimized exposure to danger. The human stood upright, weight balanced evenly, shoulders relaxed. Their body language suggested casual observation rather than mortal terror. They occasionally shifted stance, but the movements indicated comfort adjustment rather than panic. Their physical presentation matched someone waiting for a bus, rather than facing complete ontological erasure. 30 seconds passed without the automatic safety systems engaging. The timer display showed numbers that should have been impossible according to every historical record and theoretical model. The emergency protocols remained in standby mode, their sophisticated triggers still waiting for any biological indication that rescue was required. The observation deck had fallen completely silent except for the quiet hum of equipment and the slightly too loud breathing of confused scientists. Their certainty was undergoing a gradual silent collapse that no emergency system could prevent. Elsewhere, the human was noticing how the void made their skin tingle pleasantly. They observed the sensation with detached curiosity, wondering if it related to static electricity or some other physical phenomenon they might investigate later. They made a mental note to ask about the tingling sensation during the post-experiment debrief, provided they survived long enough to have one. The feeling reminded them of walking through a misty morning back on Earth, that cool, damp sensation that made everything feel fresh and new. Human neurochemistry presented a puzzle that made the Council's medical experts reconsider everything they knew about biology. Their endocrine system produced compounds that other species classified as dangerous toxins, substances that would trigger emergency detox protocols in most civilized medical facilities. The humans treated these chemicals as normal metabolic products, sometimes even seeking out experiences that would generate more of them. Their biochemical profile read like a hazardous materials warning that had somehow developed consciousness and decided to go hiking. Under stress, humans generated substances that enhanced perception rather than triggering panic. Where other species' nervous systems would flood with fear-inducing compounds, humans produced neurotransmitters that sharpened focus and heightened awareness. Their adrenal responses didn't scream danger so much as whisper opportunities for improved performance. This biochemical mechanism apparently allowed them to process threats as puzzles, rather than reasons for immediate flight. Their bodies had evolved to treat existential crises as interesting cognitive exercises. Their neural pathways demonstrated an extraordinary ability to reinterpret existential threats as intellectual challenges. The same brain structures that signaled mortal danger in other species would light up with curiosity patterns in humans. Their cognitive frameworks apparently contained filing cabinets labeled "Things That Should Terrify" me right next to drawers marked "Fascinating Problems to Solve." This neural flexibility allowed them to approach annihilation with the same mental posture others reserved for crossword puzzles. Their minds had developed entirely different categorization systems for experiences that should universally signal retreat. The Council's medical experts found 17 distinct biochemical anomalies in human stress response. Their systems produced enzyme combinations that shouldn't exist according to standard xenobiological models. Their neurotransmitter ratios followed patterns that medical texts described as theoretically impossible. Their hormonal responses to danger resembled what other species experienced during moments of creative inspiration, rather than survival crises. Each anomaly represented another fracture in the galactic medical community's understanding of basic biology. Their bodies seemed to treat extreme danger as a form of intense focus rather than threat. Physiological markers that indicated system overload in other species signaled optimal performance in humans. Their cardiovascular responses suggested preparation for complex problem-solving rather than simple fight-or-flight reactions. Even their muscle tension patterns indicated readiness for precise movement rather than panicked flailing. Their entire biological framework appeared optimized for engaging with challenges rather than avoiding them. Standard tranquilizers had paradoxical effects on human subjects in high-stress situations. Medications designed to calm panicked beings would sometimes make humans more alert and focused. Sedatives that worked perfectly on 17 other species would occasionally produce what humans called an adrenaline rush in them. Their metabolic pathways seemed to process fear suppressants as performance enhancers in certain contexts. The pharmaceutical compatibility charts required extensive footnotes when dealing with human biochemistry. Their physiological responses suggested a fundamentally different relationship with mortality. Where other species showed biological indicators of self-preservation, overwhelming all other functions, humans demonstrated systems that prioritized understanding over immediate survival. Their bodies didn't seem to recognize the finality of death in the same way other organisms did. This biochemical approach to existence suggested they viewed mortality as a fascinating phenomenon to be studied rather than an absolute boundary to be feared. Humans weren't overcoming fear through some extraordinary effort of will. They were experiencing something entirely different at the biochemical level. Their bodies simply didn't produce the same panic responses when facing ultimate danger. This wasn't courage in the conventional sense, but rather a completely alternative biological approach to threat assessment. Their systems had evolved to treat the prospect of non-existence as an interesting data point, rather than a reason for systemic shutdown. As the monitors continued showing stable readings, the humans shifted weight comfortably from one foot to the other. They appeared to be testing how the void's unique properties affected their sense of balance. Their slight movement suggested someone finding a more comfortable position for extended observation, rather than someone facing complete ontological erasure. The safety systems remained silent, their sophisticated triggers still waiting for biological distress that the human body apparently didn't know how to produce. The archives revealed scattered references that suddenly looked less like mythology and more like missed memos, deep in the historical databases, buried under layers of academic dismissal. Ancient texts contained descriptions that matched what they were witnessing in real time. Most civilizations had creation myths or hero legends about beings who could walk through darkness unharmed. These stories appeared in epic poems, religious texts, and folk traditions across dozens of species. The Council's historical division had cataloged them all with the same patronizing classification: primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through supernatural frameworks. The Krillix migration. Legends spoke of void walkers who helped them cross dark spaces between stars during their species' early spacefaring days. Their oral histories described beings of light and shadow who moved through the emptiness without ships or protection, guiding lost vessels to safety. Academic papers had analyzed these stories as metaphorical representations of navigation instincts or early astronomical observations. The standard interpretation suggested the voidwalkers symbolized courage or divine intervention, rather than actual entities. Now those scholarly papers were being pulled up on screens with trembling appendages. Ancient Gelman tablets described beings of light who could withstand the great emptiness that existed before creation. Their crystalline historical records, some dating back 500,000 years, contained precise geometric descriptions of entities that existed in pure nothingness without disintegrating. The scientific community had dismissed these as philosophical abstractions or early attempts at cosmological modeling. The tablet's mathematical precision had been attributed to the Gelman's inherent love of patterns rather than actual documentation. Their translations had been filed under religious studies rather than xenobiology. These references had been universally classified as religious symbolism rather than historical record. The academic consensus held that primitive cultures used such stories to explain terrifying natural phenomena they couldn't otherwise comprehend. The Department of Xenohistorical Studies had 17 standardized categories for dismissing such accounts, ranging from metaphorical abstraction to pre-scientific speculation. Their entire framework for understanding history involved filtering out anything that contradicted established scientific principles. They'd been trained to recognize pattern recognition errors in ancient cultures, not potential truths they'd overlooked. Now, council historians were re-examining these myths with uncomfortable urgency. They pulled ancient texts from digital storage, running new analytical algorithms designed to detect patterns they'd previously been programmed to ignore. Their search parameters now included terms like biological anomaly and alternative consciousness states, where previously they'd only looked for symbolic representation and cultural metaphor. The historical division's servers hummed with renewed activity as centuries of dismissed data suddenly demanded re-evaluation. Their entire historical framework might have been filtering out inconvenient data points for millennia. The sophisticated analysis tools they used to study ancient cultures contained built-in assumptions about what constituted factual reporting versus mythological embellishment. Anything that contradicted established scientific understanding automatically received lower credibility scores. Their historical methods had been designed to confirm what they already knew, rather than discover what they might have missed. This systematic dismissal of contradictory evidence now appeared less like scholarly rigor and more like institutional blindness. They were discovering that their science might have been blind to possibilities outside their narrow framework. The very tools they used to analyze reality contained built-in limitations based on what they believed possible. Their measurement systems could only detect what they'd programmed them to look for. Their historical methods could only validate what they already accepted as true. The human in the chamber wasn't just challenging their understanding of physics, they were revealing the limitations of their entire epistemological approach to the universe. Meanwhile, the human subject was counting seconds by their own heartbeat. They'd developed this technique during long meditation sessions back on Earth, finding their pulse more reliable than external timekeeping devices in altered states of consciousness. Their internal rhythm continued at steady cadence while surrounded by nothingness that should have stopped it completely. Each beat marked another moment of impossible existence, another data point contradicting everything the galaxy believed about biology and reality. The safety systems remained silent, their sophisticated triggers still waiting for distress signals that the human body continued refusing to produce. Humanity's relationship with the unknown differed fundamentally from other species in ways that went beyond mere biological quirks. Most civilizations developed elaborate rituals to ward off or appease dangerous unknowns, creating complex systems of avoidance and protection. Their cultural evolution showed clear patterns of building higher fences, developing better warning systems, and creating increasingly sophisticated ways to keep the terrifying unknown at a safe distance. The galaxy's standard approach to danger involved creating buffers, establishing safety margins, and maintaining careful separation from anything that might threaten existence. Their entire philosophical framework treated the unknown as something to be managed, contained, or escaped. Humans created tools to explore and understand what they didn't comprehend. Their technological development showed a persistent pattern of building instruments specifically designed to approach danger rather than avoid it. Where other species developed better warning systems, humans built better observation equipment. Their history was filled with examples of deliberately approaching what others systematically avoided. They would see a dangerous phenomenon and immediately start designing methods to get closer to it. Their approach to the unknown wasn't about maintaining safety distances, but about reducing them for better examination. Their historical record showed this pattern repeating across centuries of development. While others built higher walls, humans developed better climbing equipment to see what was on the other side. When faced with dangerous environments, they created protective gear that allowed entry, rather than warning systems that prevented approach. Their technological evolution consistently prioritized understanding over safety in ways that other species found baffling. This wasn't occasional recklessness, but a cultural preference embedded in their approach to problem-solving. Their fiction was filled with stories of confronting monsters rather than fleeing from them. Their entertainment media featured narratives about exploring dangerous places and engaging with terrifying phenomena. Where other species told cautionary tales about the consequences of curiosity, humans created heroic stories about the rewards of investigation. Their mythological traditions celebrated figures who faced overwhelming dangers and returned with new knowledge. This narrative preference suggested a fundamental cognitive difference in how they processed threat scenarios. Psychological profiles indicated they derived satisfaction from overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. Their neurological reward systems activated when solving difficult problems or facing fears. Studies of their behavior showed increased dopamine responses during successful engagements with dangerous situations. This biochemical reinforcement mechanism apparently made them seek out rather than avoid potentially threatening scenarios. Their brains seemed to treat danger as an opportunity for achievement rather than a reason for retreat. The very concept of impossible seemed to function as an invitation rather than a warning in human psychology. Their language contained phrases like "challenge accepted" and "watch me" in response to statements about impossibility. Their educational systems encouraged questioning established limits and testing boundaries. This cognitive approach meant that whenever someone declared something couldn't be done, humans treated it as a personal suggestion rather than a factual statement. Their entire cultural framework was built around the idea that limits existed to be examined and possibly overcome. This represented a cognitive approach the Council had never accounted for in their models. Their psychological frameworks assumed self-preservation would always override curiosity. Their safety protocols were built around the universal truth that beings would avoid certain destruction. The human approach suggested that for some minds, understanding might be more important than surviving. This wasn't a flaw in their programming, but a complete alternative operating system for engaging with reality. As the exposure time reached 2 minutes, the human adjusted their standing position slightly. They shifted weight from one foot to the other, the movement casual and relaxed. Their posture remained upright and observant rather than defensive or fearful. The slight adjustment suggested comfort and stability rather than distress or discomfort. The safety systems continued their silent vigil, still waiting for biological signals that the human mind and body seemed determined not to produce. After 90 seconds, the observation deck had fallen completely silent. The only sounds came from life support systems and the quiet hum of monitoring equipment. Scientists had stopped checking instruments and simply stared at the displays, their professional composure giving way to something resembling religious awe mixed with scientific confusion. The Vexillarian's 16 limbs hung, motionless in midair, while the Gelman collective's crystalline forms showed internal refractions that their technical manual classified as extreme cognitive dissonance. The room felt like a library where someone had just announced the books were wrong about everything. The emergency extraction protocol remained in standby mode, still waiting for any indication to activate. Its sophisticated algorithms had cycled through 17 different distress scenarios, each returning negative results. The system kept checking its own calibration against backup sensors, running diagnostic routines that confirmed its perfect functionality. It was designed to detect terror, panic, disintegration patterns, not calm observation. The safety mechanisms hung in digital limbo, their emergency triggers untouched, their rescue protocols gathering virtual dust while the human continued existing where existence shouldn't be possible. Biometric readings showed patterns that matched human meditation practices rather than catastrophic stress responses. Heart rate variability indicated deep relaxation. Respiration patterns suggested controlled breathing exercises. Neural activity showed the distinctive signatures of focused awareness. The physiological markers aligned with what humans called mindfulness states, rather than the expected terror-induced system overload. The displays looked like someone had plugged wellness retreat data into an apocalyptic scenario simulation by mistake. The safety systems kept scanning for disaster indicators that simply weren't appearing in the expected configurations. The subject's brain activity indicated a state of focused calm rather than terror. Neural pathways associated with fear responses remained quiet, while regions linked to curiosity and observation showed heightened engagement. The areas that should have been screaming danger signals were instead processing sensory information with clinical detachment. This wasn't the neurological profile of someone facing annihilation. It resembled someone studying an interesting natural phenomenon. Their cognitive framework appeared to be treating the void as a fascinating subject for examination rather than a threat to be feared. Council members exchanged looks that conveyed centuries of certainty unraveling. Their glances across the observation deck carried the weight of millennia of scientific understanding coming apart at the seams. The Vexillarians' multiple eyes blinked in unsynchronized patterns indicating professional distress. The Gelman collective's crystalline surfaces showed subtle color shifts that translated to fundamental paradigm shift in progress. Their silent communication involved raised appendages, slight posture changes, and minute facial expressions that all asked the same unspoken question: did we misunderstand reality itself? Their entire understanding of biology, psychology, and physics was being challenged in real time. The foundational principles they'd built their civilization upon were demonstrating alarming gaps. Their models of consciousness, their frameworks for danger response, their theories about the relationship between life and nothingness, all were showing themselves to be incomplete. They weren't just witnessing an anomaly. They were watching their entire epistemological framework collapse. The very tools they used to understand the universe were proving inadequate to describe what was happening before them. The protocols they had built their civilization around were proving incomplete rather than wrong. Their safety systems functioned perfectly within their design parameters. The problem was that reality had parameters they hadn't accounted for. Their emergency measures could handle panic, terror, and biological collapse with flawless efficiency. They just couldn't process calm curiosity in the face of ultimate danger. The systems were working exactly as intended. It was their intentions that had been too limited. They were witnessing something their science claimed was impossible according to every law and principle they understood. The humans' continued existence represented not just a data point, but a fundamental challenge to their conception of reality itself. This wasn't an exception to their rules. It was evidence that their rules described only part of a much larger picture. Their certainty was dissolving into a much more interesting and terrifying uncertainty. Elsewhere, the human was wondering if the void had a distinctive smell. They sniffed the air cautiously, noting the complete absence of any olfactory sensation. The nothingness didn't smell like anything, which struck them as both expected and slightly disappointing. They made a mental note to include this observation in their post-experiment report, assuming they survived to write one. The lack of scent felt like a missed opportunity for the void to make more of an impression. At the 2-minute mark, the human subject turned toward the observation window with a movement that defied every expectation. Their rotation wasn't the jerky, panicked motion the safety systems were designed to detect, nor the defensive curl that biological organisms typically adopted when facing existential threats. It was a calm, deliberate pivot suggesting intentional communication rather than desperate pleading. The movement flowed with the natural ease of someone turning to address a colleague across a room, not someone trapped in a sphere of pure nothingness that should have erased them from existence milliseconds earlier. The council members leaned forward as one coordinated organism, their diverse physiologies expressing identical anticipation through different physical means. The Vexillarians extended multiple limbs toward consoles. The Gelman collective's crystalline surfaces focused their internal refractions toward the display, and the Krillix adjusted their eye stalks for better viewing angles. They expected to see the classic signs of distress, the widened pupils of terror, the facial muscle contractions of agony, the physiological markers of system collapse that had been documented across thousands of species. Their training had prepared them to recognize death throes, not casual observation. The subject's facial muscles arranged themselves in a configuration that triggered the expression, "Analysis Software's Anomaly Alert." The system, designed to categorize distress patterns across 17,000 species, began cycling through its extensive database of pain responses, fear expressions, and neurological collapse indicators. It compared the muscle arrangement against templates for agony, terror, desperation, and existential dread. Each comparison returned negative results with increasing confidence intervals. The software's confidence score dropped below acceptable parameters, triggering a secondary review by more sophisticated pattern recognition algorithms. It wasn't a grimace of pain or a rictus of fear that the systems recognized from previous void exposure incidents. Those expressions involved specific contractions around the eyes, particular tensions in the forehead, distinctive patterns around the mouth that signaled unbearable suffering. This configuration showed none of the classic markers of distress that the emergency protocols were designed to detect. The facial muscles displayed a symmetry and relaxation that contradicted everything they knew about beings facing annihilation. The pattern recognition software began searching less likely categories, its algorithms growing increasingly confused. The muscular arrangement matched human social signaling patterns rather than distress responses. The slight upward curve at the corners of the mouth, the relaxed positioning of the eyebrows, the gentle crinkling around the eyes. These were configurations the system had previously encountered only in human communication contexts. The software's social interaction module, normally used for diplomatic translation services, suddenly found relevance in an existential crisis scenario. It began cross-referencing the expression against human emotional signaling databases with growing perplexity. Their facial muscles were forming what humans called a smile in non-threatening social contexts. This particular configuration typically indicated recognition, acknowledgement, or mild amusement among their species. It was the expression humans used when greeting friends, appreciating humor, or expressing quiet satisfaction. The emergency systems had no protocols for dealing with social acknowledgement gestures in life-threatening situations. Their programming assumed that facing certain death would produce certain responses, not casual social cues. The subject was expressing something other than suffering or fear. Their facial configuration suggested acknowledgement, perhaps even mild appreciation of the situation. The expression contained no elements of panic, no indications of distress, no signals of system collapse. It was the calm, composed face of someone who had discovered something interesting and wanted to share that discovery. This wasn't the response of an organism fighting for survival. It was the expression of a consciousness engaging with its environment. As the realization spread through the observation deck, the emergency systems remained stubbornly inactive. Their sophisticated triggers continued waiting for distress signals that never arrived, their rescue protocols hanging in perpetual readiness for a crisis that wasn't happening. The safety mechanisms designed to respond to the most terrifying scenarios the galaxy could imagine had no programming for dealing with quiet satisfaction in the face of absolute nothingness. The human's expression contained no trace of the expected terror or pain that should accompany void exposure. Their facial muscles showed none of the classic distress patterns that the emergency systems were designed to detect. The monitoring equipment reported complete absence of the physiological markers that normally signaled catastrophic system failure in biological organisms. This wasn't the face of someone facing annihilation. It was the calm countenance of someone making casual observations. Their eyes showed curiosity rather than the dilated panic response that should have been present. The pupils remained normal-sized instead of expanding in terror. The gaze held focus and attention rather than the unfocused stare of overwhelming fear. The eye movement suggested active observation and pattern recognition rather than the desperate scanning of someone seeking escape. Their visual behavior matched someone studying an interesting phenomenon rather than someone facing certain erasure. The slight upward curve of their mouth suggested satisfaction, not suffering. The facial muscle configuration indicated mild amusement or contentment rather than pain or distress. This particular arrangement of features typically signaled positive social engagement among humans rather than negative emotional states. The expression contained elements of recognition and acknowledgement that completely contradicted the expected response to existential threat. Biometric correlates indicated the expression was genuine, rather than a stress response. The neural patterns showed consistency with authentic emotional states rather than fear-induced facial contractions. The muscle movements flowed naturally rather than showing the jerky, involuntary motions of distress. The physiological data confirmed this was a deliberate social signal rather than a symptom of system collapse. Every measurement suggested the expression reflected their actual experience rather than masking some hidden suffering. Neural activity patterns associated with fear were completely absent from the readings. The amygdala showed no signs of activation. The hypothalamic responses remained baseline. The panic pathways stayed silent. The brain regions that should have been screaming danger signals continued displaying patterns associated with calm observation. The neurological data painted a picture of quiet curiosity rather than existential terror. Their cognitive framework simply wasn't processing the situation as threatening. The subject appeared to be experiencing something akin to pleasant discovery. Their physiological markers suggested mild enjoyment rather than suffering. The biochemical readings showed patterns that humans associated with satisfying intellectual engagement. Their entire biological presentation indicated they found the experience interesting rather than terrifying. This wasn't endurance, it was something closer to appreciation. Their posture remained relaxed, shoulders easy rather than hunched in defense against impending doom. The body language suggested comfort and ease rather than the tense readiness for fight or flight. The slight forward lean indicated interest and engagement rather than defensive curling. Their physical presentation matched someone listening to pleasant music rather than facing complete ontological erasure. The smile seemed to acknowledge the observers rather than ignore their presence. The slight eye crinkling and head tilt suggested social connection rather than solitary suffering. The expression carried elements of shared experience rather than isolated agony. This wasn't the face of someone lost in personal trauma. It was the face of someone including others in their discovery. This simple human expression shattered centuries of certainty about biological responses to ultimate danger. That slight upward curve of the mouth, those calm eyes, that relaxed posture, together they represented a complete contradiction to everything the galaxy believed about consciousness facing the void. The emergency protocols had no response because they'd been designed around assumptions that simply didn't apply to this particular being. Meanwhile, the human was thinking about how to describe the experience to friends back home. They mentally composed phrases that might capture the unique sensory qualities of nothingness. They wondered if their friends would believe them or think they were exaggerating. They considered whether the experience would make a good story at social gatherings. Their mental focus remained on communication and connection rather than survival or escape. Silence stretched across the observation deck for 7 full seconds. It wasn't the comfortable silence of focused work or the respectful silence of observation. This was the dead air of complete cognitive malfunction. The sound of 17 species' collective understanding hitting a wall it hadn't known was there. The only movement came from display screens refreshing data that made less sense with each update. The only sounds were the faint hum of life support and the slightly too loud breathing of beings whose professional composure was unraveling. Protocol demanded immediate extraction at any sign of non-standard response. The safety manual contained 17 detailed scenarios for unexpected reactions, each with specific emergency measures. The systems were designed to respond to anomalies faster than conscious thought could process them. Every council member had trained for this moment their entire careers, drilling the response protocols until they became automatic. The procedures existed precisely for situations where reality stopped behaving predictably. No one moved to activate the emergency systems or terminate the experiment. Their training warred with their observations, creating paralysis where there should have been decisive action. The Vexillarian's 16 limbs remained frozen in mid-air, rather than executing emergency protocols. The Gelman collective's crystalline forms showed internal refractions indicating system conflict. Their instincts said one thing while the evidence before them said something completely different. The disconnect between expectation and reality created perfect stillness. Scientists stared at their displays as if waiting for them to correct themselves. They watched the biometric readings with the focused intensity of people expecting the numbers to suddenly make sense. Their eyes moved between the human's calm vital signs and the chamber's environmental data, searching for some explanation that would restore order to their understanding. They checked calibration indicators that had already verified themselves 17 times. The instruments kept reporting the same impossible data with stubborn consistency. The emergency protocols had no contingency for subject appears to be enjoying themselves. The safety systems contained detailed responses for terror, panic, dissociation, and catastrophic neurological failure. They had algorithms for every known distress signal across the galactic community, but they had no programming for calm curiosity, no protocols for mild amusement, no emergency measures for someone treating existential threat as an interesting experience. The systems were perfectly designed to handle every scenario except the one actually happening. Their entire safety framework assumed certain universal biological responses to ultimate danger. The emergency extraction triggers were calibrated to specific neurological patterns that occurred across all known species. The distress detection algorithms were programmed to recognize physiological signatures that had been consistent for millennia. Their understanding of biology relied on the fundamental truth that consciousness would fight to preserve itself when facing erasure. This wasn't just scientific theory, it was the foundation of their entire approach to risk management. The humans' continued calm existence represented a fundamental break in their understanding of biology itself. This wasn't an outlier or anomaly within their existing frameworks. It was evidence that their frameworks described only part of a much larger picture. Their models of consciousness, their theories of self-preservation, their very concept of what life valued, all were demonstrating alarming gaps. They were witnessing something their science claimed was impossible according to every principle they understood. Some council members began questioning their own sensory input and instrument readings. The Vexillarians used multiple eyes to cross-check the visual data, while their other limbs ran diagnostic routines. The Gelman collective verified their internal processing against external sensors. The Krillix adjusted their eye stalks to confirm perspectives. Their professional training told them to trust the instruments, but their entire understanding of reality told them the instruments must be wrong. The conflict between data and belief created cognitive dissonance across the observation deck. They were facing evidence that their most basic assumptions about consciousness and danger were incomplete. This wasn't about recalibrating instruments or adjusting parameters. It was about reconsidering fundamental truths they'd built their civilization upon. The humans' continued existence in the void wasn't just surprising. It suggested they'd been misunderstanding the relationship between life and reality itself. Their certainty was dissolving into a much more interesting and terrifying uncertainty. As the silence continued, the human's smile widened slightly. The expression grew more pronounced, the corners of the mouth lifting a fraction higher, the eyes crinkling a bit more. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle amplification of the same calm expression that had already shattered their understanding. The movement was smooth and natural, without any of the jerky quality of distress or panic. It looked like someone recognizing an old friend across a room rather than someone facing complete ontological erasure. The human's simple gesture forced a complete re-evaluation of understanding that had stood unchallenged for centuries. That slight upward curve of the mouth, those calm eyes observing the observers, that relaxed posture in the face of absolute nothingness. It wasn't just unexpected. It was a rebuke to everything the galactic community believed about consciousness and its limits. The council members felt their certainties shifting like sand underfoot, their intellectual foundations cracking under the weight of one unassuming expression. Their smile suggested a relationship with the void that defied all conventional explanation. This wasn't the grimace of someone enduring unbearable pain or the rictus of terror they'd expected. It was the expression humans used when recognizing something familiar, when making a connection, when expressing quiet satisfaction. The configuration of facial muscles indicated acknowledgement rather than agony, curiosity rather than catastrophe. Their entire physiological presentation suggested they viewed the experience as interesting rather than terrifying. Perhaps survival wasn't about resistance, but about some other approach entirely. The galaxy had spent millennia building stronger shields, developing better warning systems, creating more sophisticated escape protocols. Their entire philosophy involved fighting against the void's erasure with increasingly advanced technology. The humans' calm existence suggested maybe they'd been thinking about the problem backward, instead of resisting the nothingness. Perhaps the answer involved some form of acceptance or understanding they hadn't considered. Maybe humans weren't withstanding the void so much as understanding it differently. Their cognitive frameworks seemed to process the experience through alternative categorization systems. Where other species saw ultimate threat, humans appeared to see fascinating phenomena. Their neural pathways treated the encounter as information to be processed, rather than danger to be avoided. This wasn't about superior strength or special protection. It was about fundamentally different perception. Their biological systems might be interpreting the experience through unique frameworks developed over their peculiar evolutionary history. The biochemical responses that should have signaled panic instead indicated focused attention. The neurological patterns that typically meant terror instead suggested curiosity. Their entire physiological approach to existence seemed optimized for engagement rather than avoidance. This wasn't a flaw in their design. It was a complete alternative operating system for dealing with the unknown. The Council's concept of survival might be too narrow to describe what was happening. Their understanding focused on physical continuity and system integrity. The humans' response suggested survival might involve something beyond mere biological persistence. Perhaps their approach valued understanding over simple existence, curiosity over comfort, engagement over escape. Their definition of survival might include elements the galaxy hadn't considered worth measuring. Their entire classification system for danger and safety needed fundamental revision. The protocols that worked perfectly for 17,000 species failed completely with this 18th. The safety measures designed around universal biological responses couldn't account for this alternative approach to existence. Their risk assessment models required complete recalibration. Their emergency protocols needed wholesale restructuring. Their very understanding of what constituted danger demanded re-examination. This wasn't an exception to their rules that could be filed away as a curiosity. It was evidence their rules described only part of a much larger reality. The humans' calm existence revealed limitations in their scientific frameworks rather than flaws in their subject. Their understanding had been complete within its parameters. The problem was the parameters themselves had been too narrow. They'd been measuring the universe with instruments that couldn't detect what they hadn't thought to look for. They were witnessing not a flaw in their science, but its inherent limitations when faced with something truly outside previous experience. Their methods worked perfectly for the reality they understood. They just hadn't understood how much reality contained. The human smile wasn't challenging their knowledge so much as revealing its boundaries. This was the moment where certainty gave way to curiosity, where established truth made room for new questions. Meanwhile, the human was making mental notes for their post-experiment report. They organized observations about sensory experiences, noted questions about void properties, and considered comparison points with other unusual phenomena they'd encountered. Their mental processes focused on documentation and analysis, rather than survival or escape. They wondered if the Council would allow follow-up experiments with adjusted parameters. Their calm continued undisturbed by the epistemological crisis they'd triggered in the observation deck. When the human finally requested extraction, the systems responded with the flawless efficiency they'd been designed to demonstrate. There was no emergency protocol to trigger, no distress signal to answer. Just a polite inquiry through the comm system about concluding the session. The safety mechanisms, which had spent the past several minutes in bewildered standby mode, executed a perfectly normal extraction sequence that felt anything but normal given the circumstances. The chamber's containment field disengaged with a soft hum that sounded almost apologetic after its prolonged irrelevance. They stepped from the chamber looking refreshed rather than traumatized. Their movements were smooth and unhurried, their posture relaxed, their expression suggesting someone returning from a mildly interesting seminar rather than facing certain annihilation. There was no staggering, no disorientation, no signs of psychological shock or neurological damage. They stretched slightly as if working out a minor stiffness, then ran a hand through their hair in a gesture of casual normalcy that felt profoundly abnormal in context. Their eyes were clear and focused, showing none of the dilated panic or unfocused terror the medical team had prepared to treat. Their first words were about the interesting sensory details they'd experienced. They mentioned the peculiar tingling sensation on their skin, the way light behaved differently near the edges of the containment field, the complete absence of auditory input despite theoretical models suggesting quantum fluctuations should produce some form of resonance. They wondered aloud about the temperature gradients within the chamber and whether the void had measurable pressure differentials. Their questions sounded like follow-up inquiries from a research symposium rather than debriefing after a near-death experience. The medical team stood with their emergency kits hanging uselessly at their sides. They asked when they could repeat the experiment with different parameters. They suggested varying the exposure duration, adjusting the containment field strength, maybe trying different measurement techniques to capture more data about void properties. Their tone was that of a researcher planning the next phase of a study, rather than someone who had just survived something that should have killed them. They mentioned wanting to bring recording equipment next time to document the visual phenomena they'd observed. The request hung in the air while the science team tried to reconcile it with their understanding of reality. Medical scans showed no damage at cellular, neural, or psychological levels. The full-body analysis revealed perfectly normal biochemistry, undisturbed neural pathways, and psychological markers indicating calm reflection rather than trauma. There were no signs of quantum decoherence at the cellular level, no evidence of neural fragmentation, no indicators of the ontological erosion that should have occurred. The human's physical and mental state appeared completely unchanged by an experience that should have unraveled their very existence. The medical scanners kept confirming their perfect health with stubborn consistency. The subject's only complaint was that the chamber floor could use better cushioning. They mentioned that standing on the hard surface for several minutes had made their feet slightly sore, and suggested adding some padding for future sessions. They wondered if the material could be temperature regulated as well, since the surface had felt somewhat cool against their bare feet. This observation about interior decorating in a chamber designed to contain absolute nothingness landed with particular force amid the scientific disbelief. The engineering team made a note while questioning their career choices. Council scientists moved like beings in a dream, performing checks by rote. Their movements were automatic, their responses mechanical, their professional composure maintained through sheer force of habit rather than actual comprehension. They ran diagnostics, reviewed data streams, and completed paperwork with the numb efficiency of people whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally altered. Their training allowed them to function while their intellectual frameworks underwent silent collapse. They performed their duties with the careful precision of sleepwalkers. Their entire framework for understanding the universe had shifted in 90 minutes. The certainties that had guided their civilization for millennia now seemed like provisional assumptions rather than absolute truths. Their models of consciousness, their theories of danger response, their very concept of what constituted impossible, all required complete re-examination. They had witnessed the foundation of their scientific understanding crack open to reveal possibilities they hadn't known existed. The change wasn't dramatic but profound, settling over them like a fine dust that would take years to fully comprehend. They had witnessed something their science said was impossible, according to every law and principle they understood. The humans' calm existence in the face of ultimate danger represented not an exception to their rules but evidence that their rules described only part of a much larger reality. Their instruments had functioned perfectly. Their protocols had been followed precisely. Their observations had been meticulously documented. The problem wasn't their methods, it was their understanding of what those methods could reveal about the universe. As the human left, they smiled at the stunned scientists in the observation area. It was the same calm, acknowledging expression they'd shown in the chamber, the slight upward curve of the mouth, the crinkling around the eyes, the relaxed facial muscles that signaled recognition rather than distress. The smile wasn't triumphant or boastful, just quietly inclusive, as if sharing a minor discovery with colleagues. It landed with the force of a physical impact, leaving silence in its wake as the observation deck door hissed shut behind them. The council's emergency session lasted 3 standard days without reaching any satisfying conclusion. They sat in the same chamber where centuries of orderly decisions had been made, but now the comfortable certainty had drained from the room. The circular table that usually facilitated consensus instead seemed to magnify their collective confusion. Delegates from 17 species shuffled data pads, adjusted seating appendages, and avoided direct eye contact across the polished surface. Their usual procedural efficiency had been replaced by something resembling a group therapy session for disappointed mathematicians. They had to reconcile the human data with everything they'd believed fundamentally true about biological existence. The numbers on their screens showed physiological readings that contradicted millennia of established science. Their instruments reported calm where there should have been terror, curiosity where they expected panic, and something disturbingly like enjoyment where they'd prepared for catastrophic system failure. The evidence was clear, consistent, and completely incompatible with their understanding of reality. Their challenge wasn't interpreting the data, it was accepting what the data implied about their own limitations. Their protocols weren't wrong in the technical sense. They were simply incomplete in ways they hadn't imagined possible. The safety systems functioned perfectly within their design parameters. The emergency measures responded exactly as programmed. The problem was that reality contained parameters they hadn't thought to include in their designs. Their understanding had been comprehensive within its scope, but the scope itself had been too narrow to account for human peculiarity. This wasn't failure. It was discovery of boundaries they hadn't known existed. Humans represented not a threat to be contained, but a different approach to existence itself. Their biological systems processed danger through alternative frameworks that prioritized understanding over avoidance. Their cognitive patterns suggested they viewed the unknown as opportunity rather than threat. This wasn't recklessness or bravery in the conventional sense. It was a fundamental reordering of how consciousness could engage with reality. They were living proof that intelligence could take forms the galaxy hadn't previously recognized. Their ability to face the void suggested possibilities beyond mere survival. Where other species developed better shields and faster escape systems, humans seemed to cultivate different relationships with danger itself. Their approach hinted that engagement might sometimes prove more effective than resistance. This wasn't about superior technology or special biological protection. It was about fundamentally reconceiving what survival could mean when faced with ultimate challenges. The Council began considering what other impossibilities might need reevaluation. Their historical archives contained numerous dismissed reports and classified anomalies that suddenly seemed worth re-examining. Ancient texts they'd categorized as mythological might contain forgotten truths. Scientific observations they'd attributed to instrument error might represent genuine phenomena. Their entire framework for distinguishing possible from impossible required careful deconstruction and reassessment. Their classification system for intelligent species needed fundamental restructuring. The standardized categories for danger response, stress tolerance, and psychological resilience all required complete revision. Their evaluation metrics had been designed around assumptions that humans proved incomplete. The forms they used to assess new species for Galactic Concord membership suddenly looked embarrassingly provincial. Their entire taxonomic approach to consciousness demanded rethinking from first principles. They were learning that intelligence might take forms they hadn't previously recognized or valued. Their measurement systems had been optimized for certain patterns of cognitive processing, while potentially overlooking others. The human approach suggested that alternative ways of engaging with reality might be equally valid, just differently focused. This wasn't about superior intelligence, but about complementary approaches to existence that their systems had failed to anticipate. The human smile had opened doors they didn't know existed in their understanding of consciousness. That simple facial gesture, so casually delivered in the face of certain erasure, had revealed limitations in their scientific frameworks that centuries of research had missed. It wasn't the data points or the biometric readings that ultimately convinced them. It was that calm, acknowledging expression that said their understanding of reality needed expanding. Meanwhile, the human subject was writing a poem about the experience. They sat in their quarters, datapad resting on their knees, trying to find words for the indescribable sensation of nothingness. They struggled with metaphors about silence and emptiness, attempting to capture the peculiar tingling on their skin and the way light behaved at the edges of perception. Their literary efforts focused on sensory details and emotional textures rather than survival or danger. They paused occasionally to sip the tea they'd requested, perfectly content while the galactic government underwent an epistemological crisis in their honor. The human smile represented not defiance against the void, but a different conversation with existence itself. Their approach suggested survival might be less about resisting what frightens us and more about understanding what fascinates us. The galaxy had built infinite layers of protection against the unknown, while humans simply brought curiosity. Perhaps the ultimate truth isn't measured by what we can withstand, but by how we choose to perceive what faces us. Sometimes the most profound discovery isn't finding new answers, but realizing we've been asking the wrong questions all along.